Hello, my friends, and welcome to yet another mini lecture on major concepts that shape American public address. Today, we are going to dive into one of the concepts associated with gender and public address here in America, and that is masculinity. This is based largely on my own research, although you can, of course, find the text I'm referencing in your public address textbooks. So let's begin with an interesting thing that has come about in the early 21st century, and that is the crisis of masculinity. If you search masculinity online or on YouTube especially, you will find literally hundreds of people complaining about the crisis in masculinity, toxic masculinity, why masculinity should be toxic, why Americans are struggling with masculinity, why masculinity is a problem, why masculinity is not a problem, why emasculinity is a problem. It goes on forever. So this is a rather interesting rhetorical moment. In our rhetorical context, we are being assaulted by the idea that masculinity is in crisis, without a definition of what masculinity actually means or what that crisis might be. And so we today are going to jump into a history of American masculinity, and we're going to talk a little bit about what is masculinity and why exactly do people think it might be facing a crisis. So we're going to begin with a history of American masculinities, and if sites like PragerU and The Art of Manliness are to be believed, this is Theodore Roosevelt, our very most manly president, whatever that might mean. So let's go back to the original colonial manhood. This is the sort of manhood or masculinity that you are going to find in the earliest days before America was a country, when it was just colonies of the British, Dutch, French, and Spanish empires. This begins around 1620 with the immigration of Puritans to New England, and it really stretches through George Washington being elected president after the First Continental Congress in 1789. And it is a masculinity of hard dichotomies. Someone is either virtuous or vicious. He is either successful or a failure. He is either powerful or fearful. He is either civilized or savage. He's either wealthy or in labor. He's either cultured and educated or low-born and ignorant. Now, these masculinities must exist within this hard dichotomy because of a number of different cultural and social and religious factors that we've talked about in other lectures, but they are epitomized, or the good version of these is epitomized by George Washington. He is a man of prayer, but a man of prayer who is not afraid to sacrifice the lives of his men to achieve his end. He is a godly and righteous man who marries a widow and definitely owns slaves. He is powerful, he is civilized, including in the times that he slaughters people who are of different Indian ethnicities. He is virtuous to a fault. We are all familiar with the story of the cherry tree. Whether or not it's true, it was the predominant story or narrative of Washington's life. And he is very well cultured and well educated. But colonial manhood is not going to see a young nation through its infancy. And so then we begin to move into the manhood of the Republic. And what you'll find with each of these is that they overlap slightly, but they come to a head, or they come to a crux where you have someone who is the quintessential, the epitome, the truthful picture of this manhood, right at the point where the wave begins to crest and a new manhood steps up to take its place. The manhood of the new republic is the masculinity that replaces the masculinity of the colonial era. And this is a masculinity that tries to be as European as humanly possible. You see men with ascots and tails and tuxedos. You see people who even wear wigs or powder their hair to look more European. This is a picture of Alexander Hamilton. Long before he reaches 40, his hair is still black, but he powders it to make it look whiter and more senior. And there are specific characteristics of this masculinity. Specifically, these must be free men. They cannot be indentured servants or slaves. They must be white. A good man of the New Republic is always white, as defined, like we've talked about in previous years, as truly only European from France or from England. So it is a very limited idea of whiteness. He must be property owning, and it's much better if he is slave owning. He is again white. Yes, that's on there twice. It was an absolutely vital thing to be able to pass for white. He must be married. There cannot be any sense that he is a single man, a queer man in the meaning of that word both then and now. He must have children. He can be an agrarian or a tradesman. He must be a Protestant. There are there are vanishingly few Catholic American men or noblemen. He must be respectable by his community, and he must be educated. If you think about Benjamin Banneker's writing, he is aping this type of masculinity. And so that is the manhood of the New Republic, and it is perhaps best personified by John Quincy Adams, someone who was a professor at Harvard, never dressed in anything other than a starched collar, and used all three of his names. But that manhood really only lasted for a few years of the New Republic before it would be replaced by something much more recognizable to us today as American masculinity, the manhood of the frontier. And this stretches specifically from 1820 with the foundation of Jacksonian democracy through 1890 and the so-called closing of the frontier. This masculinity is going to sound a lot more normal, a lot more American to your ears. This is a man who is okay if he is isolated. He can often be unmarried. He is white still, but he has little property, often able to carry everything he needs in a saddlebag on his horse. He could be a gold miner or a cowboy. He's an Indian hunter or a Pony Express rider or a tracker. The quintessential manhood for this era is Davey Crockett. He is the man who is king of the wild frontier. Now, bear in mind, he never went much farther west than Tennessee and Kentucky, but he's the king of the wild frontier. This is the manhood of the Alamo. This is the manhood of the Great Plains Indian Wars. This is the manhood of mining for gold in California. This is the manhood of the wild, wild West. This is a manhood that is designed for expansionism. This is a manhood that is a rhetoric designed to encourage people to leave their home and their comfort to fulfill what eventually becomes called America's manifest destiny, to move any native or indigenous peoples off the continent or exterminate them, and institute white European colonization across the entire country. This is a manhood that is comfortable with guns and uses them even by necessity. It is a manhood that is not refined. Their rhetoric, if you read Davey Crockett, is often called rhetoric of taking the skin off. It's mockery. It's making fun of. There's a bro culture in the manhood of the frontier. This is an American masculinity that lasts. However, it is not the only masculinity functioning during this time. We also have a distinct category that we need to look at, and that is Southern masculinity. And Southern masculinity gets created as, hear me here, it gets created or constituted as somehow unique and different and special from the rest of America. This is also going to sound familiar to you. Now, this is perhaps the longest lasting manhood in myth at very least. And it is designed to institute and promote slaveholding and to make masculinity okay with slaveholding. So as you can see, it truly begins to be a cultural force in 1706. This will sound familiar because that is the institution of slave codes in Virginia, which quickly spread within about 2 decades to every state that is slaveholding. Those black codes are often, although not always, revoked or changed when states in the North begin doing away with slavery, but every slave state does have these types of black codes. It gets instantiated and becomes especially important in the South because slavery lasts longer there. Remember, the South was not the only place where slavery was prevalent. It was prevalent in all northern states as well. But this masculinity is perhaps best summed up by the phrase, "How dare you question my right to own others, sir?" And I use that "good sir" on the end on purpose. It was actually what one member of the House of Representatives from the South called another member from the North before the gentleman from the South beat his head in, placing him in a coma for the remainder of his life for calling out his hypocrisy on slavery. It is a gentlemanly manhood, concerned with its own dignity and its own honor. It is explicitly reserved for slaveholders. The average white farmer in the American South did not have access to this particular type of Southern masculinity. It was, of course, white, it was married, but it was violent in defense of slavery, honor, and dignity, and it was absolutely mythologized in the lost cause narrative we've discussed before. Why is this important? Because it sets up another theme of masculinity, that all of these traits, both the violence and the dignity, both the honor and the property owning, can somehow have a moral component. They are what make America good or not good. And that helps us see a little bit why perhaps we might have crises in masculinity. It's not so much about the men as it is about what it means to be a moral American. And the truth is, the crisis of masculinity did not begin in the 21st century. As a matter of fact, the first crisis of masculinity articles published in the United States came out in 1890. Yep, full century and almost a half ago now, 1890, with the so-called closing of the frontier. People began to wonder what will become of the men. Now, there are a lot of pressures on these characteristics of masculinity that we've seen in American history before 1890. So, immigration is redefining who gets to be white. Oh no! The frontier is settled. How shall we make boys into men? The frontier was what helped men become men, not be boys or dandies anymore. Oh no! Women want rights. Oh no! Black men want rights too. What will we do? What will we do? Oh no! How will men become noble and high-minded if they have to go to school with women? Men must be wealthy, but not all men can be wealthy. What shall we do? Men must be self-made, but most jobs are working for someone else now. Oh no! What shall we do? How will men prove themselves without a frontier? And this last question is the one that always spurs a crisis of masculinity. There is this very clear theme in these American masculinities that we've been seeing, that a man must be able to prove himself. Masculinity is not something that a person just gets to have. It instead has to be proven. And that is where we begin to see the 20th century's answers to the crisis of masculinity. and that is called Strenuous Manhood. And from about the 1920s to the present, obviously beginning with Theodore Roosevelt in 1909, but it begins to be a literary and cultural phenomenon after Roosevelt is defeated in his second and third runs for the presidency. And strenuous manhood is defined by engagement with war, sports, violence, strength, and sexuality. So this 20th and now 21st century manhood is highly aggressive. It's the manhood that doesn't let a girl say no, keeps emailing her, texting her, shows up to her house and holds a boombox over its head, like an 80s movie, because manhood is inherently aggressive. It is emotionless and detached unless dealing with falling in love or being angry. This isn't a manhood where it's acceptable to just have a full human range of emotions. They must be suppressed. It is financial provision for a family. Therefore, it requires able-bodiedness. It requires able-mindedness, or what we might now call neurotypicality. It requires having a job and being able to work a job. It requires making more or above average for an American salary, so it makes it a middle class or upper middle class. It requires sexual prowess and promiscuity. So here you have to go and learn with some other women who are not good women how to be good sexually, in order to be good enough sexually to then be a family man. Yes, this masculinity is very enmeshed with inherent contradictions. This was one of the things that makes it challenging as a rhetoric and causes these crises, right? It is individual and isolated, focused on accumulating material goods. The guy with the nice truck, the guy with the awesome car, the guy with the nice house, perfect apartment, well-trained dog, whatever it might be. This man must be a leader in whatever way that means to his particular subculture, and this man must be athletic. Again, focusing in those last two on neurotypicality and physical ability. And we begin to see these manhoods mediated through cultural archetypes. And we see these still today, so they're really quite prevalent, and you'll recognize them as either folks that you try to be, folks that you engage with, or folks that you know. There's the weekend warrior and the family man. There's the funny guy and the athlete. There's the bro and the mogul and the bad boy. The entrepreneur is there with the exotic man of mystery. The genius stands next to the player or the ladies' man. These stereotypes, or these archetypes, give a version of how to be an American man that gives a little bit more flexibility through mediated culture than we see in earlier pictures, but it still limits the possibilities for how manhood can function and how masculinity can be recognized. So, why the rhetorical crisis of masculinity? Let's talk a little bit about that rhetoric. First, we have to understand that masculinity as a construct is rhetorical. So we've already learned that largely gender and sex are rhetorical constructs. But beyond even gender and sex, masculinity, the way we perform our gender and sex, is also a rhetorical construct. So if all gender is rhetorical, or that is defined by how society discusses it, gender, remember, is defined as the roles, behaviors, activities, attributes, and opportunities that any society considers appropriate for girls and boys, or women and men. Therefore, manhood is constituted by those who discuss it just like any other collective identity. The same way we can constitute who gets to be an American, we constitute who gets to be a masculine man. And boy, does that have consequences for American rhetoric if you are gendered male but not rhetorically constituted as masculine. Manhood, then, is foundational to rhetorical culture in America. As a matter of fact, if you look carefully through debates, we aren't reading a lot of debates in class, but if you look carefully through debates, especially about equality and rights, you will often find people arguing my equal manhood. As a matter of fact, there's even one truly astonishing phrase from 1867 when a black senator from Alabama, he was elected during Reconstruction, obviously, stands up and says, "Look at me. Is my manhood not equal to yours?" The double entendre, I can only imagine, must not have been intended. But equal manhood is a foundation for being eligible for rights in America. And we know from studying the discourse that that is often meant literally. If someone is not man enough to be American, that person may not be man enough to deserve the right to vote, the right to earn property, the right to own property, the right to earn income, the right to themselves. Rhetoric in general, then, and speaking, public speaking especially, is also inherently gendered male. A lot of my research has focused on how women navigate the idea that rhetoric is inherently gendered. How do you stand up and speak when doing so makes you inherently unwomanly for about 200 years of American history and culture? That brings us finally to this idea. Manhood, masculinity, as we've talked about, doesn't actually exist. It must be constituted in the rhetoric that we use to discuss it. That means that manhood is a cultural and rhetorical construct, which means that one of its defining characteristics is that it's always changing, right? The way that we talk about it is always going to mean that manhood as a cultural construct is inherently changing. However, constituting manhood requires a stable definition of masculinity. That is, what a man should be able to know and do. A definition that is not always changing. So constituting American manhood requires stability, while manhood, the construct of masculinity, is inherently always changing. What does this mean? This means that in America, an inherently conservative country with an inherently progressive rhetoric, there is and always will be tension between historic shoulds of manhood and the current demands placed upon men. Change and stability, therefore, are always in tension. And this is why we have this problem about a crisis in masculinity. The crisis in masculinity is the inherent nature of the thing. Masculinity doesn't exist. It needs to be rhetorically defined. And if we have to rhetorically define it, how will we use it stably, as if it's an already existing thing, to construct the rest of what we mean by America? Today, you are going to engage with some different texts that try to deal with what this means. How can they engage with masculinity and define it in such a way that it is stable enough to define America?